Chapter 8. The sun was up so high when I waked that I judged it was after 8 o'clock. I laid there in the grass in the cool shade thinking about things, and feeling rested and rather comfortable and satisfied. I could see the sun out at 1 or 2 holes, but mostly it was big trees all about, and gloomy in there amongst them. There was freckled places on the ground where the light sifted down through the leaves, and the freckled places swapped about a little, showing there was a little breeze up there. A couple of squirrels sat on a limb and jabbered at me very friendly. I was powerful lazy and comfortable, didn't want to get up and cook breakfast. Well, I was dozing off again when I thinks I hears a deep sound of boom away up the river. I rouses up and rests on my elbow and listens. Pretty soon I hears it again. I hopped up and went and looked out at a hole in the leaves, and I see a bunch of smoke laying on the water a long ways up about abreast the ferry. And there was the ferry boat full of people floating along down. I knowed what was the matter now. Boom, I see the white smoke squirt out of the ferry boat's side. You see, they was firing cannon over the water, trying to make my carcass come to the top. I was pretty hungry, but it weren't going to do for me to start a fire because they might see the smoke. So I sat there and watched the cannon smoke and listened to the boom. The river was a mile wide there, and it always looks pretty on a summer morning, so I was having a good enough time seeing them hunt for my remainders if I only had a bite to eat. Well, then I happened to think how they always put quicksilver in loaves of bread and float them off, because they always go right to the drowned carcass and stop there. So says I'll keep a lookout, and if any of them's floating around after me, I'll give them a show. I changed to the Illinois edge of the island to see what luck I could have, and I weren't disappointed. A big double loaf come along, and I most got it with a long stick, but my foot slipped and she floated out further. Of course, I was where the current set and the closest to the shore. I knowed enough for that. But by and by along comes another one, and this time I won. I took out the plug and shook out the little dab of quicksilver and set my teeth in. It was baker's bread, what the quality eat, none of your low-down corn pone. I got a good place amongst the leaves and sat there on a log, munching the bread and watching the ferry boat, and very well satisfied. And then something struck me. I says, now I reckon the widow or the parson or somebody prayed that this bread would find me, and here it is gone and done it. So there ain't no doubt but there is something in that thing that is. There's something in it when a body like the widow or the parson prays, but it don't work for me, and I reckon it don't work for only just the right kind. I lit a pipe and had a good long smoke, and went on watching. The ferry boat was floating with the current, and I allowed I'd have a chance to see who was aboard when she come along, because she would come in close where the bread did. When she'd got pretty well along down towards me, I put out my pipe and went to where I fished out the bread, and laid down behind a log on the bank in a little open place. Where the log forked I could peep through. By and by she come along, and she drifted in so close that they could have run out a plank and walked ashore. Most everybody was on the boat. Pap and Judge Thatcher and Bessie Thatcher and Bessie Thatcher and Joe Harper and Tom Sawyer and his old Aunt Polly and Sid and Mary and plenty more. Everybody was talking about the murder, but the captain broke in and says, "Look sharp, now the current sets in the closest here, and maybe he's washed ashore and got tangled amongst the brush at the water's edge. I hope so anyway." I didn't hope so. They all crowded up and leaned over the rails nearly in my face and kept still, watching with all their might. I could see them first rate, but they couldn't see me. Then the captain sung out, "Stand away," and the cannon let off such a blast right before me that it made me deaf with the noise and pretty near blind with the smoke, and I judged I was gone. If they'd have had some bullets in, I reckon they'd have got the corpse they was after. Well, I see I warn't hurt, thanks to goodness. The boat floated on and went out of sight around the shoulder of the island. I could hear the booming now and then further and further off, and by after an hour I didn't hear it no more. The island was 3 mile long. I judged they had got to the foot and was giving it up. But they didn't yet a while. They turned around the foot of the island and started up the channel on the Missouri side, under steam and booming once in a while as they went. I crossed over to that side and watched them. When they got abreast the head of the island, they quit shooting and dropped over to the Missouri shore and went home to the town. I knowed I was all right now. Nobody else would come a-hunting after me. I got my traps out of the canoe and made me a nice camp in the thick woods. I made a kind of a tent out of my blankets to put my things under so the rain couldn't get at them. I catched a catfish and haggled him open with my saw, and towards sundown I started my campfire and had supper. Then I set out a line to catch some fish for breakfast. When it was dark, I sat by my campfire smoking and feeling pretty well satisfied, but by and by it got sort of lonesome, and so I went and sat on the bank and listened to the current swashing along and counted the stars and drift logs and rafts that come down, and then went to bed. There ain't no better way to put in time when you are lonesome. You can't stay so you soon get over it. And so for 3 days and nights. No difference, just the same thing. But the next day I went exploring around down through the island. I was boss of it, it all belonged to me, so to say, and I wanted to know all about it, but mainly I wanted to put in the time. I found plenty strawberries, ripe and prime, and green summer grapes, and green raspberries, and the green blackberries was just beginning to show. They would all come handy by and by, I judged. Well, I went fooling along in the deep woods till I judged I weren't far from the foot of the island. I had my gun along, but I hadn't shot nothing. It was for protection, thought I would kill some game nigh home. About this time I mighty near stepped on a good-sized snake, and it went sliding off through the grass and flowers, and I after it, trying to get a shot at it. I clipped along, and all of a sudden I bounded right onto the ashes of a campfire that was still smoking. My heart jumped up amongst my lungs. I never waited for to look further, but uncocked my gun and went sneaking back on my tiptoes as fast as ever I could. Every now and then I stopped a second amongst the thick leaves and listened, but my breath come so hard I couldn't hear nothing else. I slunk along another piece further, then listened again, and so on and so on. If I see a stump, I took it for a man. If I trod on a stick and broke it, it made me feel like a person had cut one of my breaths in two, and I only got half, and the short half too. When I got to camp I weren't feeling very brash. There weren't much sand in my craw, but I says, this ain't no time to be fooling around. So I got all my traps into my canoe again so as to have them out of sight, and I put out the fire and scattered the ashes around to look like an old last year's camp, and then clumb a tree. I reckon I was up in the tree 2 hours, but I didn't see nothing. I didn't hear nothing. I only thought I heard and seen as much as 1,000 things. Well, I couldn't stay up there forever, so at last I got down, but I kept in the thick woods and on the lookout all the time. All I could get to eat was berries and what was left over from breakfast. By the time it was night I was pretty hungry, so when it was good and dark I slid out from shore before moonrise and paddled over to the Illinois bank about 1/4 of a mile. I went out in the woods and cooked a supper, and I had about made up my mind I would stay there all night when I hear a plunkety-plunk, plunkety-plunk, and says to myself, horses coming, and next I hear people's voices. I got everything into the canoe as quick as I could, and then went creeping through the woods to see what I could find out. I hadn't got far when I hear a man say, "We better camp here if we can find a good place. The horses is about beat out. Let's look around." I didn't wait, but shoved out and paddled away easy. I tied up in the old place and reckoned I would sleep in the canoe. I didn't sleep much. I couldn't, somehow, for thinking. And every time I waked up I thought somebody had me by the neck. So the sleep didn't do me no good. By and by I says to myself, I can't live this way. I'm a-going to find out who it is that's here on the island with me. I'll find it out or bust. Well, I felt better right off. So I took my paddle and slid out from shore just a step or two, and then let the canoe drop along down amongst the shadows. The moon was shining, and outside of the shadows it made it most as light as day. I poked along well on to an hour, everything still as rocks and sound asleep. Well, by this time I was most down to the foot of the island. A little ripply, cool breeze begun to blow, and that was as good as saying the night was about done. I give her a turn with the paddle and brung her nose to shore, then I got my gun and slipped out and into the edge of the woods. I sat down there on a log and looked out through the leaves. I see the moon go off watch, and the darkness begin to blanket the river. But in a little while I see a pale streak over the treetops, and knowed the day was coming. So I took my gun and slipped off towards where I had run across that campfire, stopping every minute or two to listen. But I hadn't no luck. Somehow I couldn't seem to find the place. But by and by, sure enough, I catched a glimpse of fire away through the trees. I went for it, cautious and slow. By and by I was close enough to have a look, and there laid a man on the ground. It most give me the fan tods. He had a blanket around his head, and his head was nearly in the fire. I sat there behind a clump of bushes, in about 6 foot of him, and kept my eyes on him steady. It was getting gray daylight now. Pretty soon he gapped and stretched himself and hove off the blanket, and it was Miss Watson's Jim. I bet I was glad to see him, I says. "Hello, Jim," and skipped out. He bounced up and stared at me wild. Then he drops down on his knees and puts his hands together and says, "Don't hurt me, don't. I hain't ever done no harm to a goes. I always liked dead people and done all I could for 'em. You go and get in de river again while you belongs and don't do nothing to old Jim. I'd use all as yo' friend." Well, I warn't long making him understand I warn't dead. I was ever so glad to see Jim. I warn't lonesome now. I told him I warn't afraid of him telling the people where I was. I talked along, but he only sat there and looked at me, never said nothing. Then I says, "It's good daylight. Lays get breakfast. Make up your campfire good. What's the use AR making up the campfire to cook strawberries and sich truck? But you got a gun, hain't you? Then we can get something better than strawberries." "Strawberries and such truck," I says. "Is that what you live on?" "I couldn't get nothing else," he says. "Why, how long you been on the island, Jim?" "I come here the night arter you's killed." "What, all that time?" "Yes, indeedy." "And ain't you had nothing but that kind of rubbish to eat?" "No, saw nothing else." "Well, you must be most starved, ain't you?" "I reckon I could eat a hoss." "I think I could. How long you been on the island?" "Since the night I got killed." "No, WY, what has you lived on?" "But you got a gun." "Oh yes, you got a gun. That's good. Now you kill something, I'll make up the fire." So we went over to where the canoe was, and while he built a fire in a grassy open place amongst the trees, I fetched meal and bacon and coffee pot and frying pan, and sugar in tin cups, and the nigger was set back considerable, because he reckoned it was all done with witchcraft. I catched a good big catfish too, and Jim cleaned him with his knife, and fried him. When breakfast was ready, we lolled on the grass and eat it smoking hot. Jim laid it in with all his might, for he was most about starved. Then, when we had got pretty well stuffed, we laid off and lazied. By and by Jim says, "But looky here, Huck, who was it dat you's killed in dat shanty effort, weren't you?" Then I told him the whole thing, and he said it was smart. He said Tom Sawyer couldn't get up no better plan than what I had. Then I says, "How do you come to be here, Jim, and how'd you get here?" He looked pretty uneasy and didn't say nothing for a minute. Then he says, "Maybe I better not tell." "Why, Jim?" "Well, dey's reasons. But you wouldn't tell on me if I used to tell you, would you, Huck?" "Blamed if I would, Jim." "Well, I believe you, Huck. I run off." "Jim." "But mind, you said you wouldn't tell. You know you said you wouldn't tell, Huck." "Well, I did. I said I wouldn't, and I'll stick to it. Honest Injun, I will. People would call me a low-down abolitionist and despise me for keeping mum, but that don't make no difference. I ain't a-going to tell, and I ain't a-going back there anyways. So now, Liz know all about it." "Well, you see, it used this way. Old Mrs. Dat's Miss Watson, she pecks on me all the time and treats me pooty rough, but she allus said she wouldn't sell me down to Orleans. But I noticed dey was a nigger trader round the place considerable lately, and I begin to get wannassy. Well, one night I creeps to do pooty late, and do warn't quite shet, and I hear old Mrs. tell de widder she gwine to sell me down to Orleans, but she didn't want to, but she could get $800 for me. And it used a big stack o' money she couldn't resist. De widder, she tried to get her to say she wouldn't do it, but I never waited to hear de res. I lit out mighty quick, I tell you. I tuck out and shin down de hill, and spec to steal a skift long to show Samara's bove de town, but dey was people a-stirring it, so I hid in de old tumble-down cooper shop on de bank to wait for everybody to go away. Well, I was da all night. Dey was somebody round all de time. Long 'bout 6 in de mornin' skiffs begin to go by. And 'bout 8 or 9 every skift dat went long woos talkin' 'bout how yo' pap come over to de town and say you's killed. Dese last skiffs woos full o' ladies and gentlemen a-goin' over for to see de place. Sometimes dey'd pull up at de shore and take a res befo dey started across. So, by de talk, I got to know all 'bout de killin'. I use powerful sorry you's killed, Huck, but I ain't no mo' now. I laid da under de shavins all day. I use hungry, but I warn't afeard becase I knowed ol' Mrs. Underwidder was going to start to de camp meet and right arter breakfast and be gone all day. And dey knows I goes off wid de cattle 'bout daylight, so dey wouldn't 'spect to see me round de place. And so dey wouldn't miss me till arter dark in de evenin'. De youth servants wouldn't miss me, case dey'd shin out and take holiday soon as de old folks ooze out en de way. Well, when it come dark, I tuck out up de river road, and went 'bout 2 mile air more to wad dey warn't no houses. I'd made up my mind 'bout what I's agwine to do. You see, if I kept on trying to get away afoot, de dogs would track me. If I stole a skift to cross over, dey'd miss dat skift, you see. And dey'd know 'bout why I'd land on de other side, and why to pick up my track. So I says, a raft is what I's arter at doin' make no track. I see a light a-comin' round de pea and bimeby, so I wade and then shove a log ahead o' me and swum more 'n halfway across de river. and got in monks to drift wood, and kept my head down low. And kinder swum agin de current till de raft come along. Den I swum to de stern UV and tuck a holt. It clouded up and used pooty dark for a little while, so I clum up and laid down on de planks. De men use all way yonder in de middle, what de lantern was. De river was arisen. And dey was a good current, so I reckoned that by foe in de mornin' I'd be 25 mile down de river, and den I'd slip in just before daylight and swim a show, and take to de woods on de Illinois side. But I didn't have no luck. When we used most down to de head or de island, a man begin to come aft wid de lantern. I see it warn't no use fer to wait, so I slid overboard and struck out fer de island. Well, I had a notion I could land mos anywheres. But I couldn't. Bank too bluff. I usually most of de foot ear de island before I found a good place. I went into de woods and jedged I wouldn't fool wid rafts no mo, long as dey moved de lantern round so. I had my pipe in a plug ear dog leg, and some matches in my cap, and they weren't wet, so I use all right. And so you ain't had no meat nor bread to eat all this time. Why didn't you get mud turkles? How you gwine to get mem? You can't slip up on and grab 'em, and how's a body gwine to hit 'em wid a rock? How could a body do it in de night? And I warn't gwine to show myself on de bank in de daytime. Well, that's so. You've had to keep in the woods all the time, of course. Did you hear him shooting the cannon? Oh yes, I know dey was arter you. I see 'em go by here, watched 'em through de bushes. Some young birds come along, flying a yard or two at a time and lighting. Jim said it was a sign it was going to rain. He said it was a sign when young chickens flew that way, and so he reckoned it was the same way when young birds done it. I was going to catch some of them, but Jim wouldn't let me. He said it was death. He said his father laid mighty sick once, and some of them catched a bird, and his old granny said his father would die, and he did. And Jim said you mustn't count the things you are going to cook for dinner, because that would bring bad luck. The same if you shook the tablecloth after sundown. And he said if a man owned a beehive and that man died, the bees must be told about it before sunup next morning, or else the bees would all weaken down and quit work and die. Jim said bees wouldn't sting idiots, but I didn't believe that, because I had tried them lots of times myself and they wouldn't sting me. I had heard about some of these things before, but not all of them. Jim knowed all kinds of signs. He said he knowed most everything. I said it looked to me like all the signs was about bad luck, and so I asked him if there weren't any good luck signs. He says, "Mighty few, and dey ain't no use to a body. What you want to know when good luck's a-comin' for? Want to keep it off." And he said, "If you's got hairy arms and a hairy briz, it's a sign dat you's agwine to be rich. Well, dey's some use in a sign like dat, case it's so fur ahead. You see, maybe you's got to be po a long time fust, and so you might git discouraged and kill yosef if you didn't know by de sign dat you gwine to be rich bimeby. Have you got hairy arms and a hairy breast, Jim?" "What's de use to ax dat question? Don't you see I has?" "Well, are you rich?" "No, but I been rich once and gwine to be rich again. Once I had $14, but I tucked to speculat in and got busted out." "What did you speculate in, Jim?" "Well, fust I tackled stock." "What kind of stock?" "Why, livestock cattle, you know. I put $10 in a cow. But I ain't gwine to risk no mo money in stock. The cow up and died on my hands." "So you lost the $10? "No, I didn't lose it all. I lost 'bout 9 of it. I sold the hide on taller for $1.10. "You had $5.10 left. Did you speculate any more?" "Yes, you know that one-leg nigger dat belongs to old Mr. Bradish? Well, he sot up a bank and say anybody dat put in $1 would get $4 mo at the end of the year. Well, all the niggers went in, but they didn't have much. I was doing why one dat had much. So I stuck out for mo dan $4, and I said if I didn't get it, I'd start a bank myself. Well, of course that nigger want to keep me out ear to business, because he says they weren't business enough for 2 banks. So he say I could put in my $5 and he pay me $35 at DNR a year. So I done it. Den I reckoned I'd invest the $35 right off and keep things a-movin'. Dey was a nigger named Bob dat had ketched a wood flat, and his marster didn't know dime, bought it off en him and told him to take the $35 when DNR the year come. But somebody stole the wood flat dat night, and next day the one-leg nigger say the bank's busted. So dey didn't none uvious get no money. What did you do with the 10 cents, Jim? Well, I was gwine to spend it, but I had a dream, and the dream told me to give it to a nigger named Balam's ass. They call him for short. He's one of them chuckleheads, you know. But he's lucky, they say. And I see I warn't lucky. The dream say let Balam invest the 10 cents and he'd make a raise for me. Well, Balam he tuck the money, and when he was in church he heard the preacher say that whoever give to the poor lend to the Lord, bound to get his money back 100 times. So Balam he tuck and give the 10 cents to the P.O. and laid low to see what was going to come of it. Well, what did come of it, Jim? Nothing never come of it. I couldn't manage to collect that money no way, and Balam he couldn't. I ain't going to lend no more money doubt I see the security. Bound to get your money back 100 times, the preacher says. If I could get the 10 cents back, I'd call it squaw and be glad he chanced. Well, it's all right anyway, Jim. Long as you're going to be rich again sometime or other. Yes, and I's rich now, come to look at it. I owns myself, and I's with $800. I wished I had the money. I wouldn't want no more. Chapter 9. I wanted to go and look at a place right about the middle of the island that I'd found when I was exploring, so we started and soon got to it, because the island was only 3 miles long and 1/4 of a mile wide. This place was a tolerable long, steep hill or ridge about 40 foot high. We had a rough time getting to the top. The sides was so steep and the bushes so thick. We tramped and clumb around all over it, and by found a good big cavern in the rock, most up to the top on the side towards Illinois. The cavern was as big as 2 or 3 rooms bunched together, and Jim could stand up straight in it. It was cool in there. Jim was for putting our traps in there right away, but I said we didn't want to be climbing up and down there all the time. Jim said if we had the canoe hid in a good place and had all the traps in the cavern, we could rush there if anybody was to come to the island, and they would never find us without dogs. And besides, he said them little birds had said it was going to rain, and did I want the things to get wet? So we went back and got the canoe and paddled up abreast the cavern and lugged all the traps up there. Then we hunted up a place close by to hide the canoe in, amongst the thick willows. We took some fish off of the lines and set them again and begun to get ready for dinner. The door of the cavern was big enough to roll a hogshead in, and on one side of the door the floor stuck out a little bit and was flat and a good place to build a fire on. So we built it there and cooked dinner. We spread the blankets inside for a carpet and eat our dinner in there. We put all the other things handy at the back of the cavern. Pretty soon it darkened up and begun to thunder and lighten, so the birds was right about it. Directly it begun to rain. And it rained like all fury, too, and I never see the wind blow so. It was one of these regular summer storms. It would get so dark that it looked all blue-black outside, and lovely, and the rain would thrash along by so thick that the trees off a little ways looked dim and spiderwebby, and here would come a blast of wind that would bend the trees down and turn up the pale underside of the leaves. And then a perfect ripper of a gust would follow along and set the branches to tossing their arms as if they was just wild, and next, when it was just about the bluest and blackest est, it was as bright as glory, and you'd have a little glimpse of tree tops a-plunging about away off yonder in the storm, hundreds of yards further than you could see before dark as sin again in a second. And now you'd hear the thunder let go with an awful crash, and then go rumbling, grumbling, tumbling down the sky towards the underside of the world, like rolling empty barrels downstairs where it's long stairs and they bounce a good deal, you know. Jim, this is nice, I says. I wouldn't want to be nowhere else but here. Pass me along another hunk of fish and some hot corn bread. Well, you wouldn't have been here if it hadn't have been for Jim. You'd have been down in the woods wide out any dinner and getting most drownded, too, dat you would, honey. Chickens knows when it's gwine to rain, and so do de birds, Chile. The river went on raising and raising for 10 or 12 days till at last it was over the banks. The water was 3 or 4 foot deep on the island in the low places and on the Illinois bottom. On that side it was a good many miles wide, but on the Missouri side it was the same old distance across a half a mile, because the Missouri shore was just a wall of high bluffs. Daytimes we paddled all over the island in the canoe. It was mighty cool and shady in the deep woods, even if the sun was blazing outside. We went winding in and out amongst the trees, and sometimes the vines hung so thick we had to back away and go some other way. Well, on every old broken-down tree you could see rabbits and snakes and such things, and when the island had been overflowed a day or two, they got so tame, on account of being hungry, that you could paddle right up and put your hand on them if you wanted to. But not the snakes and turtles, they would slide off in the water. The ridge our cavern was in was full of them. We could have had pets enough if we'd wanted them. One night we catched a little section of a lumber raft, nice pine planks. It was 12 foot wide and about 15 or 16 foot long, and the top stood above water 6 or 7 inches of solid level floor. We could see saw logs go by in the daylight sometimes, but we let them go. We didn't show ourselves in daylight. Another night when we was up at the head of the island, just before daylight, here comes a frame house down on the west side. She was a 2-story and tilted over considerable. We paddled out and got aboard clumb in at an upstairs window. But it was too dark to see yet, so we made the canoe fast and set in her to wait for daylight. The light begun to come before we got to the foot of the island. Then we looked in at the window. We could make out a bed and a table and 2 old chairs and lots of things around about on the floor, and there was clothes hanging against the wall. There was something laying on the floor in the far corner that looked like a man. So Jim says, "Hello, you." But it didn't budge. So I hollered again, and then Jim says, "The man ain't asleep, he's dead. You hold still, I'll go and see." He went and bent down and looked and says, "It's a dead man." "Yes, indeed, he naked too. He's been shot in the back. I reckon he's been dead 2 or 3 days. Come in, Huck, but don't look at his face, it's too gashly." I didn't look at him at all. Jim throwed some old rags over him, but he needn't done it. I didn't want to see him. There was heaps of old greasy cards scattered around over the floor and old whiskey bottles and a couple of masks made out of black cloth, and all over the walls was the ignorantest kind of words and pictures made with charcoal. There was 2 old dirty calico dresses and a sunbonnet, and some women's underclothes hanging against the wall, and some men's clothing too. We put the lot into the canoe, it might come good. There was a boy's old speckled straw hat on the floor, I took that too. And there was a bottle that had had milk in it, and it had a rag stopper for a baby to suck. We would have took the bottle, but it was broke. There was a seedy old chest, and an old hair trunk with the hinges broke. They stood open, but there weren't nothing left in them that was any account. The way things was scattered about, we reckoned the people left in a hurry, and weren't fixed so as to carry off most of their stuff. We got an old tin lantern, and a butcher knife without any handle, and a brand new Barlow knife worth 2 bits in any store, and a lot of tallow candles and a tin candlestick, and a gourd and a tin cup, and a ratty old bedquilt off the bed. And a reticule with needles and pins and beeswax and buttons and thread and all such truck in it, and a hatchet and some nails, and a fish line as thick as my little finger with some monstrous hooks on it, and a roll of buckskin, and a roll of buckskin, and a leather dog collar, and a horseshoe shoe. And some vials of medicine that didn't have no label on them, and just as we was leaving I found a tolerable good curry comb, and Jimmy found a ratty old fiddle bow, and a wooden leg. The straps was broke off of it, but barring that it was a good enough leg, though it was too long for me and not long enough for Jim, and we couldn't find the other one, though we hunted all around. And so, take it all around, we made a good haul. When we was ready to shove off, we was a 1/4 of a mile below the island, and it was pretty broad day, so I made Jim lay down in the canoe and cover up with the quilt, because if he set up people could tell he was a nigger a good ways off. I paddled over to the Illinois shore and drifted down most a half a mile doing it. I crept up the dead water under the bank and had no accidents and didn't see nobody. We got home all safe. Chapter 10. After breakfast I wanted to talk about the dead man and guess out how he come to be killed, but Jim didn't want to. He said it would fetch bad luck, and besides, he said, he might come and hand us. He said a man that warn't buried was more likely to go aha and ting around than one that was planted and comfortable. That sounded pretty reasonable, so I didn't say no more, but I couldn't keep from studying over it and wishing I knowed who shot the man and what they done it for. We rummaged the clothes we'd got and found $8 in silver sewed up in the lining of an old blanket overcoat. Jim said he reckoned the people in that house stole the coat, because if they'd have knowed the money was there, they wouldn't have left it. I said I reckoned they killed him, too, but Jim didn't want to talk about that. I says, "Now you think it's bad luck, but what did you say when I fetched in the snake skin that I found on the top of the ridge day before yesterday? You said it was the worst bad luck in the world to touch a snake skin with my hands. Well, here's your bad luck. We've raked in all this truck and $8 besides. I wish we could have some bad luck like this every day, Jim." "Never you mind, honey, never you mind. Don't you get too pert. It's a comin'. Mind I tell you, it's a comin'." It did come, too. It was a Tuesday that we had that talk. Well, after dinner Friday we was laying around in the grass at the upper end of the ridge, and got out of tobacco. I went to the cavern to get some and found a rattlesnake in there. I killed him and curled him up on the foot of Jim's blanket, ever so natural, thinking there'd be some fun when Jim found him there. Well, by night I forgot all about the snake, and when Jim flung himself down on the blanket while I struck a light, the snake's mate was there and bit him. He jumped up yelling, and the first thing the light showed was the varmint curled up and ready for another spring. I laid him out in a second with a stick, and Jim grabbed Pap's whiskey jug and begun to pour it down. He was barefooted, and the snake bit him right on the heel. That all comes of my being such a fool as to not remember that wherever you leave a dead snake, its mate always comes there and curls around it. Jim told me to chop off the snake's head and throw it away, and then skin the body and roast a piece of it. I'd done it, and he eat it and said it would help cure him. He made me take off the rattles and tie them around his wrist, too. He said that would help. Then I slid out quiet and throwed the snakes clear away amongst the bushes, for I weren't going to let Jim find out it was all my fault, not if I could help it. Jim sucked and sucked at the jug, and now and then he got out of his head and pitched around and yelled, but every time he come to himself he went to sucking at the jug again. His foot swelled up pretty big, and so did his leg, but by and by the drunk begun to come, and so I judged he was all right, but I'd rather been bit with a snake than Pap's whiskey. Jim was laid up for 4 days and nights. Then the swelling was all gone and he was around again. I made up my mind I wouldn't ever take a holt of a snake's skin again with my hands, now that I see what had come of it. Jim said he reckoned I would believe him next time. And he said that handling a snake's skin was such awful bad luck that maybe we hadn't got to the end of it yet. He said he'd rather see the new moon over his left shoulder as much as 1,000 times than take up a snake's skin in his hand. Well, I was getting to feel that way myself, though I've always reckoned that looking at the new moon over your left shoulder is one of the carelessest and foolishest things a body can do. Old Hank Bunker done it once, and bragged about it, and in less than 2 years he got drunk and fell off of the shot tower, and spread himself out so that he was just a kind of a layer, as you may say, and they slid him edgeways between 2 barn doors for a coffin, and buried him so they say. But I didn't see it. Pap told me. But anyway, it all come of looking at the moon that way, like a fool. Well, the days went along, and the river went down between its banks again, and about the first thing we done was to bait one of the big hooks with a skinned rabbit, and set it and catch a catfish that was as big as a man, being 6 foot 2 inches long, and weighed over 200 pounds. We couldn't handle him, of course he would have flung us into Illinois. We just sat there and watched him rip and tear around till he drowned. We found a brass button in his stomach and a round ball and lots of rubbish. We split the ball open with the hatchet, and there was a spool in it. Jim said he'd had it there a long time, to coat it over so and make a ball of it. It was as big a fish as was ever catched in the Mississippi, I reckon. Jim said he hadn't ever seen a bigger one. He would have been worth a good deal over at the village. They peddle out such a fish as that by the pound in the market house there. Everybody buys some of him. His meat's as white as snow and makes a good fry. Next morning I said it was getting slow and dull, and I wanted to get a stirring up some way. I said I reckon I would slip over the river and find out what was going on. Jim liked that notion, but he said I must go in the dark and look sharp. Then he studied it over and said, couldn't I put on some of them old things and dress up like a girl? That was a good notion, too. So we shortened up one of the calico gowns, and I turned up my trouser legs to my knees and got into it. Jim hitched it behind with the hooks, and it was a fair fit. I put on the sun bonnet and tied it under my chin, and then for a body to look in and see my face was like looking down a joint of stovepipe. Jim said nobody would know me, even in the daytime, hardly. I practiced around all day to get the hang of the things, and by I could do pretty well in them. Only Jim said I didn't walk like a girl, and he said I must quit pulling up my gown to get at my breeches pocket. I took notice and done better. I started up the Illinois shore in the canoe just after dark. I started across to the town from a little below the ferry landing, and the drift of the current fetched me in at the bottom of the town. I tied up and started along the bank. There was a light burning in a little shanty that hadn't been lived in for a long time, and I wondered who had took up quarters there. I slipped up and peeped in at the window. There was a woman about 40-year-old in there knitting by a candle that was on a pine table. I didn't know her face. She was a stranger, for you couldn't start a face in that town that I didn't know. Now this was lucky, because I was weakening. I was getting afraid I had come people might know my voice and find me out. But if this woman had been in such a little town 2 days, she could tell me all I wanted to know, so I knocked at the door and made up my mind I wouldn't forget I was a girl. Chapter 11. Come in, says the woman, and I did. She says, take a cheer. I done it. She looked me all over with her little shiny eyes and says, what might your name be? Sarah Williams. Whereabouts do you live? In this neighborhood? Nome. In Hookerville, 7 miles below. I've walked all the way and I'm all tired out. Hungry too, I reckon. I'll find you something. No, I ain't hungry. I was so hungry I had to stop 2 miles below here at a farm, so I ain't hungry no more. It's what makes me so late. My mother's down sick and out of money and everything, and I come to tell my Uncle Abner more. He lives at the upper end of the town, she says. I ain't ever been here before. Do you know him? No, but I don't know everybody yet. I haven't lived here quite 2 weeks. It's a considerable ways to the upper end of the town. You better stay here all night. Take off your bonnet. No, I says, I'll rest a while, I reckon, and go on. I ain't afeard of the dark. She said she wouldn't let me go by myself, but her husband would be in by and by, maybe in an hour and a half, and she'd send him along with me. Then she got to talking about her husband, and about her relations up the river, and her relations down the river, and about how much better off they used to was, and how they didn't know but they'd made a mistake coming to our town, instead of letting well alone, and so on and so on and so on. Till I was afeard I had made a mistake coming to her to find out what was going on in the town, but by and by she dropped on to Pap and the murder, and then I was pretty willing to let her clatter right along. She told about me and Tom Sawyer finding the $6,000, only she got it 10, and all about Pap and what a hard lot he was and what a hard lot I was, and at last she got down to where I was murdered. I says, "Who done it? We've heard considerable about these goings-on down in Hookerville, but we don't know who 'twas that killed Huck Finn." "Well, I reckon there's a right smart chance of people here that'd like to know who killed him. Some think old Finn done it himself." "No, is that so?" "Most everybody thought it at first. He'll never know how nigh he come to getting lynched. But before night they changed around and judged it was done by a runaway nigger named Jim." "Why he?" I stopped. I reckoned I better keep still. She run on and never noticed I had put in at all. "The nigger run off the very night Huck Finn was killed. So there's a reward out for him, $300. And there's a reward out for old Finn, $200. You see, he come to town the morning after the murder and told about it, and was out with them on the ferry boat hunt. And right away after he up and left. Before night they wanted to lynch him, but he was gone, you see. Well, next day they found out the nigger was gone. They found out he hadn't been seen since 10 o'clock the night the murder was done. So then they put it on him, you see. And while they was full of it, next day, back comes old Finn, and went boo-hooing to Judge Thatcher to get money to hunt for the nigger all over Illinois with. The judge gave him some, and that evening he got drunk, and was around till after midnight with a couple of mighty hard-looking strangers. And then went off with them. Well, he ain't come back since, and they ain't looking for him back till this thing blows over a little. For people thinks now that he killed his boy and fixed things so folks would think robbers done it. And then he'd get Huck's money without having to bother a long time with a lawsuit. People do say he warn't any too good to do it. Oh, he's sly, I reckon. If he don't come back for a year, he'll be all right. You can't prove anything on him. You know everything will be quieted down then, and he'll walk in Huck's money as easy as nothing. Yes, I reckon so, I don't see nothing in the way of it. Has everybody quit thinking the nigger done it? Oh no, not everybody. A good many thinks he done it. But they'll get the nigger pretty soon now, and maybe they can scare it out of him. Why are they after him yet? Well, you're innocent, ain't you? Does $300 lay around every day for people to pick up? Some folks think the nigger ain't far from here. I'm one of them, but I ain't talked it around. A few days ago I was talking with an old couple that lives next door in the log shanty. And they happened to say hardly anybody ever goes to that island over yonder that they call Jackson's Island. Don't anybody live there? Says I. No, nobody, says they. I didn't say any more, but I'd done some thinking. I was pretty near certain I'd seen smoke over there about the head of the island. A day or two before that, so I says to myself, like as not that nigger's hiding over there anyway, says I. It's worth the trouble to give the place a hunt. I ain't seen any smoke since, so I reckon maybe he's gone, if it was him. But husband's going over to see him and another man. He was gone up the river, but he got back today, and I told him as soon as he got here 2 hours ago. I had got so uneasy I couldn't set still. I had to do something with my hands, so I took up a needle off of the table and went to threading it. My hands shook, and I was making a bad job of it. When the woman stopped talking, I looked up, and she was looking at me pretty curious and smiling a little. I put down the needle and thread, and let on to be interested, and I was, too, and says, $300 is a power of money. I wish my mother could get it. Is your husband going over there tonight? Oh, yes. He went uptown with the man I was telling you of, to get a boat and see if they could borrow another gun. They'll go over after midnight. Couldn't they see better if they was to wait till daytime? Yes, and couldn't the nigger see better, too? After midnight he'll likely be asleep, and they can slip around through the woods and hunt up his campfire all the better for the dark, if he's got one. I didn't think of that. The woman kept looking at me pretty curious, and I didn't feel a bit comfortable. Pretty soon she says, "What did you say your name was, honey?" "Mary Williams." Somehow it didn't seem to me that I said it was Mary before, so I didn't look up. Seemed to me I said it was Sarah, so I felt sort of cornered, and was afeared maybe I was looking it too. I wished the woman would say something more. The longer she sat still, the uneasier I was. But now she says, "Honey, I thought you said it was Sarah when you first come in." "Oh, yes'm, I did. Sarah Mary Williams. Sarah's my first name. Some calls me Sarah, some calls me Mary." "Oh, that's the way of it." "Yes'm." I was feeling better then, but I wished I was out of there anyway. I couldn't look up yet. Well, the woman fell to talking about how hard times was, and how poor they had to live, and how the rats was as free as if they owned the place, and so forth and so on, and then I got easy again. She was right about the rats. You'd see one stick his nose out of a hole in the corner every little while. She said she had to have things handy to throw at them when she was alone, or they wouldn't give her no peace. She showed me a bar of lead twisted up into a knot, and said she was a good shot with it generally, but she'd wrenched her arm a day or two ago, and didn't know whether she could throw true now. But she watched for a chance and directly banged away at a rat, but she missed him wide and said, ouch, it hurt her arm so. Then she told me to try for the next one. I wanted to be getting away before the old man got back, but of course I didn't let on. I got the thing, and the first rat that showed his nose I let drive, and if he'd have stayed where he was, he'd have been a tolerable sick rat. She said that was first rate, and she reckoned I would hive the next one. She went and got the lump of lead and fetched it back, and brought along a hank of yarn which she wanted me to help her with. I held up my two hands, and she put the hank over them, and went on talking about her and her husband's matters. But she broke off to say, "Keep your eye on the rats. You better have the lead in your lap handy." So she dropped the lump into my lap just at that moment, and I clapped my legs together on it, and she went on talking, but only about a minute. Then she took off the hank and looked me straight in the face, and very pleasant, and says, "Come now, what's your real name?" "What, Mum?" "What's your real name? Is it Bill, or Tom, or Bob? Or what is it?" I reckon I shook like a leaf, and I didn't know hardly what to do. But I says, "Please to don't poke fun at a poor girl like me, Mum. If I'm in the way here, I'll—" "No, you won't. Set down and stay where you are. I ain't going to hurt you, and I ain't going to tell on you, neither. You just tell me your secret, and trust me, I'll keep it, and what's more, I'll help you. So my old man if you want him to. You see, you're a runaway prentice. That's all. It ain't anything. There ain't no harm in it. You've been treated bad, and you made up your mind to cut. Bless you, child, I wouldn't tell on you. Tell me all about it now, that's a good boy." So I said it wouldn't be no use to try to play it any longer, and I would just make a clean breast and tell her everything, but she mustn't go back on her promise. Then I told her my father and mother was dead, and the law had bound me out to a mean old farmer in the country 30 miles back from the river, and he treated me so bad I couldn't stand it no longer. He went away to be gone a couple of days. And so I took my chance and stole some of his daughter's old clothes and cleared out, and I had been 3 nights coming the 30 miles. I traveled nights and hid daytimes and slept, and the bag of bread and meat I carried from home lasted me all the way, and I had a plenty. I said I believed my Uncle Abner Moore would take care of me, and so that was why I struck out for this town of Goshen. Goshen, child. This ain't Goshen. This is St. Petersburg. Goshen's 10 miles further up the river. Who told you this was Goshen? Why, a man I met at daybreak this morning, just as I was going to turn into the woods for my regular sleep. He told me when the roads forked I must take the right hand, and 5 miles would fetch me to Goshen. He was drunk, I reckon. He told you just exactly wrong. Well, he did act like he was drunk, but it ain't no matter now. I got to be moving along. I'll fetch Goshen before daylight. Hold on a minute. I'll put you up a snack to eat. You might want it. So she put me up a snack and says, "Say, when a cow's laying down, which end of her gets up first?" Answer up prompt now, don't stop to study over it. Which end gets up first? The hind end, Mum. Well then, a horse. The forrard end, Mum. Which side of a tree does the moss grow on? North side. If 15 cows is browsing on a hillside, how many of them eats with their heads pointed the same direction? The whole 15, Mum. Well, I reckon you have lived in the country. I thought maybe you was trying to hocus me again. What's your real name now? George Peters, Mum. Well, try to remember it, George. Don't forget and tell me it's Alexander before you go, and then get out by saying it's George Alexander when I catch you. And don't go about women in that old calico. You do a girl tolerable poor, but you might fool men, maybe. Bless you, child. When you set out to thread a needle, don't hold the thread still and fetch the needle up to it. Hold the needle still and poke the thread at it. That's the way a woman most always does, but a man always does t'other way. And when you throw at a rat or anything, hitch yourself up a tiptoe and fetch your hand up over your head as awkward as you can, and miss your rat about 6 or 7 foot. Throw stiff-armed from the shoulder, like there was a pivot there for it to turn on, like a girl, not from the wrist and elbow, with your arm out to one side, but like a boy. And, mind you, when a girl tries to catch anything in her lap, she throws her knees apart, she don't clap them together, the way you did when you catch the lump of lead. Why, I spotted you for a boy when you was threading the needle. And I contrived the other things just to make certain. Now trot along to your uncle, Sarah Mary Williams George Alexander Peters, and if you get into trouble you send word to Mrs. Judith Loftus, which is me, and I'll do what I can to get you out of it. Keep the river road all the way, and next time you tramp take shoes and socks with you. The river road's a rocky one, and your feet'll be in a condition when you get to Goshen, I reckon. I went up the bank about 50 yards, and then I doubled on my tracks and slipped back to where my canoe was, a good piece below the house. I jumped in and was off in a hurry. I went upstream far enough to make the head of the island, and then started across. I took off the sunbonnet, for I didn't want no blinders on then. When I was about the middle I heard the clock begin to strike, so I stops and listens the sound come faint over the water but clear 11. When I struck the head of the island I never waited to blow, though I was most winded, but I shoved right into the timber where my old camp used to be and started a good fire there on a high and dry spot. Then I jumped in the canoe and dug out for our place, a mile and a half below, as hard as I could go. I landed and slopped through the timber and up the ridge and into the cavern. There Jim laid sound asleep on the ground. I roused him out and says, "Get up and hump yourself, Jim. There ain't a minute to lose. They're after us." Jim never asked no questions. He never said a word, but the way he worked for the next half an hour showed about how he was scared. By that time everything we had in the world was on our raft, and she was ready to be shoved out from the willow cove where she was hid. We put out the campfire at the cavern the first thing, and didn't show a candle outside after that. I took the canoe out from the shore a little piece, and took a look, but if there was a boat around I couldn't see it, for stars and shadows ain't good to see by. Then we got out the raft and slipped along down in the shade, past the foot of the island, dead still, never saying a word. Chapter 12. It must have been close on to 1 o'clock when we got below the island at last, and the raft did seem to go mighty slow. If a boat was to come along we was going to take to the canoe and break for the Illinois shore, and it was well a boat didn't come, for we hadn't ever thought to put the gun in the canoe, or a fishing line, or anything to eat. We was in rather too much of a sweat to think of so many things. It warn't good judgment to put everything on the raft. If the men went to the island I just expect they found the campfire I built and watched it all night for Jim to come. Anyways, they stayed away from us, and if my building the fire never fooled them it warn't no fault of mine. I played it as low down on them as I could. When the first streak of day began to show we tied up to a towhead in a big bend on the Illinois side and hacked off cottonwood branches with the hatchet and covered up the raft with them so she looked like there had been a cave in the bank there. A towhead is a sandbar that has cottonwoods on it as thick as harrow teeth. We had mountains on the Missouri shore and heavy timber on the Illinois side, and the channel was down the Missouri shore at that place, so we weren't afraid of anybody running across us. We laid there all day and watched the rafts and steamboats spin down the Missouri shore, and upbound steamboats fight the big river in the middle. I told Jim all about the time I had jabbering with that woman, and Jim said she was a smart one, and if she was to start after us herself she wouldn't sit down and watch a campfire. No, sir, she'd fetch a dog. Well then, I said, why couldn't she tell her husband to fetch a dog? Jim said he bet she did think of it by the time the men was ready to start, and he believed they must have gone uptown to get a dog, and so they lost all that time, or else we wouldn't be here on a towhead 16 or 17 miles below the village. No, indeedy. We would be in that same old town again. So I said I didn't care what was the reason they didn't get us as long as they didn't. When it was beginning to come on dark we poked our heads out of the cottonwood thicket and looked up and down and across nothing in sight, so Jim took up some of the top planks of the raft and built a snug wigwam to get under in blazing weather and rainy, and to keep the things dry. Jim made a floor for the wigwam and raised it a foot or more above the level of the raft, so now the blankets and all the traps was out of reach of steamboat waves. Right in the middle of the wigwam we made a layer of dirt about 5 or 6 inches deep with a frame around it to hold it to its place. This was to build a fire on in sloppy weather or chilly. The wigwam would keep it from being seen. We made an extra steering oar, too, because one of the others might get broke on a snag or something. We fixed up a short forked stick to hang the old lantern on, because we must always light the lantern whenever we see a steamboat coming downstream, to keep from getting run over, but we wouldn't have to light it for upstream boats unless we was in what they call a crossing. For the river was pretty high yet, very low banks being still a little underwater, so upbound boats didn't always run the channel but hunted easy water. This second night we run between 7 and 8 hours, with a current that was making over 4 miles an hour. We catched fish and talked, and we took a swim now and then to keep off sleepiness. It was kind of solemn, drifting down the big, still river, laying on our backs looking up at the stars, and we didn't ever feel like talking loud, and it warn't often that we laughed, only a little kind of a low chuckle. We had mighty good weather as a general thing, and nothing ever happened to us at all that night, nor the next, nor the next. Every night we passed towns, some of them away up on black hillsides, nothing but just a shiny bed of lights, not a house could you see. The 5th night we passed St. Louis, and it was like the whole world lit up. In St. Petersburg they used to say there was 20 or 30,000 people in St. Louis, but I never believed it till I see that wonderful spread of lights at 2 o'clock that still night. There warn't a sound there, everybody was asleep. Every night now I used to slip ashore towards 10 o'clock at some little village, and buy 10 or 15 cents worth of meal or bacon or other stuff to eat, and sometimes I lifted a chicken that warn't roosting comfortable and took him along. Pap always said, take a chicken when you get a chance, because if you don't want him yourself you can easy find somebody that does, and a good deed ain't ever forgot. I never see Pap when he didn't want the chicken himself, but that is what he used to say anyway. Mornings before daylight I slipped into cornfields and borrowed a watermelon, or a mushmelon, or a pumpkin, or some new corn, or things of that kind. Pap always said it warn't no harm to borrow things if you was meaning to pay them back some time, but the widow said it warn't anything but a soft name for stealing, and no decent body would do it. Jim said he reckoned the widow was partly right and Pap was partly right, so the best way would be for us to pick out 2 or 3 things from the list and say we wouldn't borrow them any more, then he reckoned it wouldn't be no harm to borrow the others. So we talked it over all one night, drifting along down the river, trying to make up our minds whether to drop the watermelons, or the cantaloupes, or the mushmelons, or what. But towards daylight we got it all settled satisfactory and concluded to drop crabapples and persimmons. We weren't feeling just right before that, but it was all comfortable now. I was glad the way it come out too, because crabapples ain't ever good, and the persimmons wouldn't be ripe for 2 or 3 months yet. We shot a waterfowl now and then that got up too early in the morning or didn't go to bed early enough in the evening. Take it all round, we lived pretty high. The 5th night below St. Louis we had a big storm after midnight with a power of thunder and lightning, and the rain poured down in a solid sheet. We stayed in the wigwam and let the raft take care of itself. When the lightning blared out we could see a big straight river ahead and high rocky bluffs on both sides. By and by says I, hello Jim, looky yonder, it was a steamboat that had killed herself on a rock. We was drifting straight down for her. The lightning showed her very distinct. She was leaning over with part of her upper deck above water, and you could see every little chimbley guy clean and clear, and a chair by the big bell with an old slouch hat hanging on the back of it when the flashes come. Well, it being away in the night and stormy and also mysterious like, I felt just the way any other boy would have felt when I see that wreck laying there so mournful and lonesome in the middle of the river. I wanted to get aboard of her and slink around a little and see what there was there, so I says, Liz, land on her, Jim. But Jim was dead against it at first. He says, I don't want to go fool and long ere no rack. We's doin' blame well, and we better let blame well alone, as the good book says, like as not days a watchman on dat rack. Watchman, your grandmother, I says, there ain't nothing to watch but the Texas and the pilot house, and do you reckon anybody's going to risk his life for a Texas and a pilot house such a night as this, when it's likely to break up and wash off down the river any minute? Jim couldn't say nothing to that, so he didn't try. And besides, I says, we might borrow something worth having out of the captain's stateroom. Seegers, I bet you, and cost 5 cents apiece, solid cash. Steamboat captains is always rich and get $60 a month, and they don't care a cent what a thing costs, long as they want it. Stick a candle in your pocket, I can't rest, Jim, till we give her a rummaging. Do you reckon Tom Sawyer would ever go by this thing? Not for pie, he wouldn't. He'd call it an adventure, that's what he'd call it, and he'd land on that wreck if it was his last act. And wouldn't he throw style into it? Wouldn't he spread himself? Nor nothing. Why, you'd think it was Christopher C. Columbus discovering Kingdom Come. I wish Tom Sawyer was here. Jim, he grumbled a little, but give in. He said we mustn't talk any more than we could help, and then talk mighty low. The lightning showed us the wreck again just in time, and we fetched the starboard derrick and made fast there. The deck was high out here. We went sneaking down the slope of it to larboard, in the dark, towards the Texas, feeling our way slow with our feet, and spreading our hands out to fend off the guys, for it was so dark we couldn't see no sign of them. Pretty soon we struck the forward end of the skylight and clumb onto it, and the next step fetched us in front of the captain's door, which was open, and by Jiminy, away down through the Texas hall we see a light. And all in the same second we seemed to hear low voices in yonder. Jim whispered and said he was feeling powerful sick, and told me to come along. I says all right, and was going to start for the raft, but just then I heard a voice wail out and say, "Oh, please don't, boys, I swear I won't ever tell." Another voice said, pretty loud, "It's a lie, Jim Turner. You've acted this way before. You always want more and your share of the truck, and you've always got it too, because you've swore T if you didn't, you'd tell. But this time you've said it just one time too many. You're the meanest, treacherousest hound in this country." By this time Jim was gone for the raft. I was just a-biling with curiosity, and I says to myself, Tom Sawyer wouldn't back out now, and so I won't either. I'm going to see what's going on here. So I dropped on my hands and knees in the little passage, and crept aft in the dark till there warn't but one stateroom betwixt me and the cross hall of the Texas. Then in there I see a man stretched on the floor and tied hand and foot, and two men standing over him, and one of them had a dim lantern in his hand and the other one had a pistol. This one kept pointing the pistol at the man's head on the floor and saying, "I'd like to. And I order to a mean skunk." The man on the floor would shrivel up and say, "Oh, please don't, Bill, I ain't ever going to tell." And every time he said that, the man with the lantern would laugh and say, "Deed you ain't. You never said no truer thing than that, you bet you." And once he said, "Hear him beg." And yet, if we hadn't got the best of him and tied him, he'd a killed us both. And what for? Just for nothing, just because we stood on our rights, that's what for. But I lay you ain't a-going to threaten nobody any more, Jim Turner. Put up that pistol, Bill. Bill says, "I don't want to, Jake Packard. I'm for killing him, and didn't he kill old Hatfield just the same way, and don't he deserve it? But I don't want him killed, and I've got my reasons for it." "Bless yo' heart for them words, Jake Packard. I'll never forget you long's I live," says the man on the floor, sort of blubbering. Packard didn't take no notice of that, but hung up his lantern on a nail and started towards where I was there in the dark, and motioned Bill to come. I crawfished as fast as I could, about 2 yards, but the boat slanted so that I couldn't make very good time, so to keep from getting run over and catched, I crawled into a stateroom on the upper side. The man came a-pawing along in the dark, and when Packard got to my stateroom, he says, "Here, come in here." And in he come, and Bill after him. But before they got in, I was up in the upper berth, cornered, and sorry I come. Then they stood there, with their hands on the ledge of the berth, and talked. I couldn't see them, but I could tell where they was by the whiskey they'd been having. I was glad I didn't drink whiskey, but it wouldn't made much difference anyway, because most of the time they couldn't a-treed me because I didn't breathe. I was too scared, and besides, a body couldn't breathe and hear such talk. They talked low and earnest. "Bill wanted to kill Turner," he says. "He said he'll tell, and he will. If we was to give both our shares to him now, it wouldn't make no difference after the row and the way we've served him. Sure's you're born, he'll turn state's evidence, now you hear me. I'm for putting him out of his troubles." "So I," says Packard, very quiet. "Blame it, I'd sorter begun to think you wasn't. Well then, that's all right. Le's go and do it." "Hold on a minute, I hain't had my say yet. You listen to me. Shooting's good, but there's quieter ways if the thing's got to be done. But what I say is this. It ain't good sense to go courtin' around after a halter if you can get at what you're up to in some way that's just as good and at the same time don't bring you into no risks. Ain't that so?" "You bet it is. But how you going to manage it this time? Well, my idea is this: we'll rustle around and gather up whatever pickings we've overlooked in the staterooms and shove for shore and hide the truck. Then we'll wait. Now I say it ain't going to be more 'n 2 hours before this wrack breaks up and washes off down the river. See, he'll be drowned. And won't have nobody to blame for it but his own self. I reckon that's a considerable sight better 'en killing of him. I'm unfavorable to killing a man as long as you can get around it. It ain't good sense. It ain't good morals. Ain't I right? Yes, I reckon you are. But suppose she don't break up and wash off. Well, we can wait the 2 hours anyway and see, can't we? All right, then come along. So they started, and I lit out, all in a cold sweat, and scrambled forward. It was dark as pitch there, but I said, in a kind of a coarse whisper, "Jim," and he answered up, right at my elbow, with a sort of a moan, and I says, "Quick, Jim, it ain't no time for fooling around and moaning. There's a gang of murderers in yonder. And if we don't hunt up their boat and set her drifting down the river so these fellows can't get away from the wreck, there's one of EM going to be in a bad fix. But if we find their boat, we can put all of EM in a bad fix, for the sheriff'll get him. Quick, hurry. I'll hunt the larboard side. You hunt the starboard. You start at the raft and—" "Oh, my lordy, RF. Dey ain't no raft no mo. She done broke loose and gone and here we is." Chapter 13. Well, I catched my breath and most fainted. Shut up on a wreck with such a gang as that. But it warn't no time to be sentimentering. We'd got to find that boat now, had to have it for ourselves. So we went a-quaking and shaking down the starboard side, and slow work it was. 2 seemed a week before we got to the stern. No sign of a boat. Jim said he didn't believe he could go any further, so scared he hadn't hardly any strength left, he said. But I said, come on, if we get left on this wreck, we are in a fix, sure. So on we prowled again. We struck for the stern of the Texas and found it, and then scrabbled along forwards on the skylight, hanging on from shutter to shutter, for the edge of the skylight was in the water. When we got pretty close to the cross-hall door, there was the skiff, sure enough. I could just barely see her. I felt ever so thankful. In another second I would have been aboard of her, but just then the door opened. One of the men stuck his head out only about a couple of foot from me, and I thought I was gone, but he jerked it in again, and says, "Heave that blame lantern out o' sight, Bill." He flung a bag of something into the boat, and then got in himself and sat down. It was Packard. Then Bill, he come out and got in. Packard says, in a low voice, "All ready, shove off." I couldn't hardly hang on to the shutters, I was so weak. But Bill says, "Hold on, did you go through him?" "No, didn't you?" "No, so he's got his share o' the cash yet." "Well, then, come along, no use to take truck and leave money." "Say, won't he suspicion what we're up to?" "Maybe he won't, but we got to have it anyway. Come along." So they got out and went in. The door slammed to because it was on the careen side, and in a half-second I was in the boat, and Jim come tumbling after me. I out with my knife and cut the rope, and away we went. We didn't touch an oar, and we didn't speak nor whisper, nor hardly even breathe. We went gliding swift along, dead silent, past the tip of the paddle box, and past the stern. Then in a second or two more we was 100 yards below the wreck, and the darkness soaked her up, every last sign of her, and we was safe and knowed it. When we was 300 or 400 yards downstream, we see the lantern show like a little spark at the Texas door for a second, and we knowed by that the rascals had missed their boat and was beginning to understand that they was in just as much trouble now as Jim Turner was. Then Jim manned the oars, and we took out after our raft. Now was the first time that I begun to worry about the men I reckon I hadn't had time to before. I begun to think how dreadful it was, even for murderers, to be in such a fix. I says to myself, there ain't no telling but I might come to be a murderer myself yet, and then how would I like it? So says I to Jim, "The first light we see will land 100 yards below it or above it, in a place where it's a good hiding place for you and the skiff, and then I'll go and fix up some kind of a yarn and get somebody to go for that gang and get them out of their scrape, so they can be hung when their time comes." But that idea was a failure, for pretty soon it begun to storm again, and this time worse than ever. The rain poured down, and never a light showed everybody in bed, I reckon. We boomed along down the river, watching for lights and watching for our raft. After a long time the rain let up, but the clouds stayed, and the lightning kept whimpering, and by a flash showed us a black thing ahead, floating, and we made for it. It was the raft, and mighty glad was we to get aboard of it again. We seen a light now away down to the right on shore, so I said I would go for it. The skiff was half full of plunder which that gang had stole there on the wreck. We hustled it on to the raft in a pile, and I told Jim to float along down and show a light when he judged he had gone about 2 miles, and keep it burning till I come. Then I manned my oars and shoved for the light. As I got down towards it, 3 or 4 more showed up on a hillside. It was a village. I closed in above the shore light and laid on my oars and floated. As I went by, I see it was a lantern hanging on the jackstaff of a double-hull ferry boat. I skimmed around for the watchman, wondering whereabouts he slept, and by I found him roosting on the bitts forward with his head down between his knees. I gave his shoulder 2 or 3 little shoves and begun to cry. He stirred up in a kind of a startlish way, but when he see it was only me, he took a good gap and stretch, and then he says, "Hello, what's up? Don't cry, bub. What's the trouble?" I says, "Pap and Mom and Sis and—" Then I broke down. He says, "Oh, dang it now, don't take on so we all has to have our troubles, and this NL come out all right. What's the matter with them? They're... Are you the watchman of the boat?" "Yes," he says, kind of pretty well satisfied like. "I'm the captain and the owner and the mate and the pilot and watchman and head deck hand, and sometimes I'm the freight and passengers. I ain't as rich as old Jim Hornback, and I can't be so blamed generous and good to Tom, Dick and Harry as what he is, and slam around money the way he does. But I've told him a many a time I wouldn't trade places with him for," says I. "A sailor's life's the life for me, and I'm derned if I'd live 2 mile out o' town, where there ain't nothing ever going on, not for all his spondulics and as much more on top of it," says I. I broke in and says, "They're in an awful peck of trouble, and—" "Who is?" "Why, Pap and Mom and Sis and Miss Hooker, and if you'd take your ferry boat and go up there." "Up where? Where are they?" "On the wreck." "What wreck?" "Why, there ain't but one." "What, you don't mean the Walter Scott?" "Yes." "Good land. What are they doing there, for gracious sakes?" "Well, they didn't go there a purpose." "I bet they didn't. Why, great goodness, there ain't no chance for AM if they don't get off mighty quick. Why, how in the nation did they ever get into such a scrape?" "Easy enough. Miss Hooker was a-visiting up there to the town." "Yes, Booth's Landing, go on." "She was a-visiting there at Booth's Landing, and just in the edge of the evening she started over with her nigger woman in the horse ferry to stay all night at her friend's house. Miss what you may call her, I disremember her name, and they lost their steering oar, and swung around and went a-floating down stern first, about 2 mile, and saddle-bagsed on the wreck, and the ferryman and the nigger woman and the horses was all lost, but Miss Hooker she made a grab and got aboard the wreck. Well, about an hour after dark we come along down in our trading scow, and it was so dark we didn't notice the wreck till we was right on it, and so we saddled bags, but all of us was saved but Bill Whipple, and, oh, he was the best creatur'. I most wished it had been me, I do. My George, it's the beatin'est thing I ever struck. And then what did you all do?" "Well, we hollered and took on, but it's so wide there we couldn't make nobody hear. So Pap said somebody got to get ashore and get help somehow. I was the only one that could swim, so I made a dash for it, and Miss Hooker she said if I didn't strike help sooner, come here and hunt up her uncle. And he'd fix the thing. I made the land about a mile below, and been fooling along ever since, trying to get people to do something, but they said, 'What, in such a night and such a current? There ain't no sense in it, go for the steam ferry now if you'll go and—' By Jackson, I'd like to, and blame it, I don't know, but I will, but who in the dingnation's going to pay for it? Do you reckon your Pap?" "Why, that's all right. Miss Hooker she told me, particular, that her Uncle Hornback. Great guns. Is he her uncle? Looky here, you break for that light over yonder way, and turn out west when you get there, and about a quarter of a mile out you'll come to the tavern, tell him to dart you out to Jim Hornback's, and he'll foot the bill. And don't you fool around any, because he'll want to know the news. Tell him I'll have his niece all safe before he can get to town. Hump yourself, now I'm a-going up around the corner here to roust out my engineer." I struck for the light, but as soon as he turned the corner I went back and got into my skiff and bailed her out, and then pulled up shore in the easy water about 600 yards and tucked myself in among some wood boats, for I couldn't rest easy till I could see the ferry boat start. But take it all around, I was feeling rather comfortable on accounts of taking all this trouble for that gang, for not many would have done it. I wished the widow knowed about it. I judged she would be proud of me for helping these rapscallions, because rapscallions and deadbeats is the kind the widow and good people takes the most interest in. Well, before long, here comes the wreck, dim and dusky, sliding along down. A kind of cold shiver went through me, and then I struck out for her. She was very deep, and I see in a minute there warn't much chance for anybody being alive in her. I pulled all around her and hollered a little, but there wasn't any answer, all dead still. I felt a little bit heavy-hearted about the gang, but not much, for I reckoned if they could stand it, I could. Then here comes the ferry boat, so I shoved for the middle of the river on a long downstream slant, and when I judged I was out of eye reach, I laid on my oars and looked back and see her go and smell around the wreck for Miss Hooker's remainders. Because the captain would know her Uncle Hornback would want them, and then pretty soon the ferry boat give it up and went for the shore, and I laid into my work and went a-booming down the river. It did seem a powerful long time before Jim's light showed up, and when it did show, it looked like it was 1,000 miles off. By the time I got there, the sky was beginning to get a little gray in the east, so we struck for an island and hid the raft and sunk the skiff and turned in and slept like dead people. Chapter 14. By and by, when we got up, we turned over the truck the gang had stole off of the wreck and found boots and blankets and clothes and all sorts of other things, and a lot of books and a spyglass and 3 boxes of cigars. We hadn't ever been this rich before in neither of our lives. The cigars was prime. We laid off all the afternoon in the woods talking, and me reading the books, and having a general good time. I told Jim all about what happened inside the wreck and at the ferry boat, and I said these kinds of things was adventures, but he said he didn't want no more adventures. He said that when I went in the Texas and he crawled back to get on the raft and found her gone, he nearly died because he judged it was all up with him. Anyway, it could be fixed for. If he didn't get saved, he would get drowned, and if he did get saved, whoever saved him would send him back home so as to get the reward, and then Miss Watson would sell him south, sure. Well, he was right, he was most always right, he had an uncommon level head for a nigger. I read considerable to Jim about kings and dukes and earls and such, and how gaudy they dressed and how much style they put on and called each other your majesty and your grace and your lordship and so on, instead of Mr. and Jim's eyes bugged out, and he was interested. He says, "I didn't know dey was so many you and me, I hain't hearn 'bout none you and scasely, but old King Solomon, unless you counts dem kings that's in a pack k yards. How much do a king get?" "Get," I says, "why, they get $1,000 a month. If they want it, they can have just as much as they want. Everything belongs to them." "Ain't dat gay? And what they got to do, Huck?" "They don't do nothing." "Why, how you talk. They just set around." "No, is dat so?" "Of course it is. They just set around, except maybe when there's a war, then they go to the war. But other times they just lazy around or go hawking, just hawking in SPSH. Do you hear a noise?" We skipped out and looked, but it warn't nothing but the flutter of a steamboat's wheel away down, coming around the point, so we come back. "Yes," says I, "and other times when things is dull, they fuss with the Parliament, and if everybody don't go just so he whacks their heads off. But mostly they hang round the harem." "Round de which?" "Harem." "What's the harem?" "The place where he keeps his wives. Don't you know about the harem? Solomon had one, he had about 1,000,000 wives." "Why, yes, that's so. I done forgot it. A harem's a boden house, I reckon. Most likely dey has rackety times in de nursery. And I reckon de wives quarrels considerable, and dat crease de racket. Yet dey say Solomon de wisest man dat ever live. I don't take no stock in dat. Becky's why. Would a wise man want to live in de mids-air such a blim-blammin' all de time? No deed he wouldn't. A wise man you'd take on build a biler factory, and den he could shet down de biler factory when he want to res. Well, but he was the wisest man anyway, because the widow she told me so, her own self. I don't care what de widder say, he warn't no wise man neuther. He had some ear to dad fetch Edie's ways I ever see. Does you know 'bout dat chili dat he was gwine to chop in two?" "Yes, the widow told me all about it." "Well den, warn't dat de beatin's notion in de world? You jest take on look at it a minute. Da's de stump, that's one ear de women has you, that's de youth or one eye Solomon. And dish year dollar bills de Chile. Buffy on you claims it. What does I do? Does I shin around mongs de neighbors on find out which you and you de bill do belong to, and han it over to de right one, all safe and sound, de way dat anybody dat had any gumption would. No, I take and whack de bill in two. And give half on it to you, and de youth or half to de youth or woman." That's the way Solomon was going to do with the Chile. Now I want to ask you what's the use here that half a bill? Can't buy nothing with it. And what use is a half a Chile? I wouldn't give a darn for $1,000,000 union. But hang it, Jim. You've clean missed the point, blame it. You've missed it 1,000 mile. Who? Me? Go long. Don't talk to me 'bout yo' pints. I reckon I know sense when I sees it on day ain't no sense in sich doings as dat. Dispute warn't 'bout a half a Chile, dispute was 'bout a whole Chile. In demand dat think he can settle a spute 'bout a whole Chile with a half a Chile don't know enough to comin' out end the rain. Don't talk to me 'bout Solomon, Huck. I knows him by de back. But I tell you, you don't get the point. Blame the point. I reckon I knows what I knows. And mind you, the real pint is down further, it's down deeper. It lays in the way Solomon was raised. You take a man that's got on why 1 or 2 chillin', is that man going to be wussful o' chillin'? No, he ain't. He can't afford it. He know how to value him. But you take a man that's got 'bout 5,000,000 chillin' runnin' round a house, and it's different. He as soon chop a chile in 2 as a cat. Dey's plenty mo. A chile or 2 more or less warn't no consequence to Solomon. Dad fetch him. I never see such a nigger. If he got a notion in his head once, there warn't no getting it out again. He was the most down on Solomon of any nigger I ever see. So I went to talking about other kings and let Solomon slide. I told about Louis XVI that got his head cut off in France long time ago, and about his little boy the Dolphin. That would have been a king, but they took and shut him up in jail, and some say he died there. Po little chap. But some says he got out and got away and come to America. That's good. But he'll be pooty lonesome day ain't no kings here, is day, Huck. No. Den he can't get no situation. What he gwine to do? Well, I don't know. Some of them gets on the police, and some of them learns people how to talk French. Why, Huck, don't the French people talk the same way we does? No, Jim, you couldn't understand a word they said, not a single word. Well, now I be ding busted. How did that come? I don't know, but it's so. I got some of their jabber out of a book. Suppose a man was to come to you and say, "Parlez-vous Franzy," what would you think? I wouldn't think nuffin. I'd take and bust him over the head, that is, if he weren't white. I wouldn't low no nigger to call me dat. Shucks, it ain't calling you anything. It's only saying, do you know how to talk French? Well, den, why couldn't he say it? Why, he is a-saying it. That's a Frenchman's way of saying it. Well, it's a blame ridiculous way, and I don't want to hear no mo' about it. Dey ain't no sense in it. Looky here, Jim, does a cat talk like we do? No, a cat don't. Well, does a cow? No, a cow don't neither. Does a cat talk like a cow or a cow talk like a cat? No, they don't. It's natural and right for 'em to talk different from each other, ain't it? Course. And ain't it natural and right for a cat and a cow to talk different from us? Why, most surely it is. Well, then, why ain't it natural and right for a Frenchman to talk different from us? You answer me that. Is a cat a man, Huck? No. Well, den, dey ain't no sense in a cat talking like a man. Is a cow a man? Ere is a cow a cat? No, she ain't either of them. Well, den, she ain't got no business to talk like either one ear the uther of 'em. Is a Frenchman a man? Yes. Well, den, Dad blame it, why don't he talk like a man? You answer me dat. I see it warn't no use wasting words you can't learn a nigger to argue. So I quit.